Today, we have a very special bonus video for you guys. It's a collection of 5 horrifying stories that'll have you wondering what could be lurking in our forests. Now, these 5 fan favorite stories have all been completely re-edited for today's episode, so even if you've seen or heard them before, it will feel like a brand new viewing experience. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is watching their favorite show that they've been looking forward to watching for weeks, join them for the viewing, but constantly interrupt them and ask questions. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the 2 older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the 2 girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes, they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking we're gonna find her. So they go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now, this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking, and so they call the police. The police show up, and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to this swamp, and they have thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl, and once again, there's nothing. Then on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. They found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves, that's what killed her. But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased because they would have been able to pick around the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals. But Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located. And so they followed the drag line into this meadow and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. And investigators said it looked like something big had been laying there. And they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with two theories that didn't really make any sense. The first one was, okay, these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belong to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. One, that this giant person even existed, and two, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans, so that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really, they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, how did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this.
As many of you may know, aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my podcast, the MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. But that's not all. In addition to that podcast, under the Ballen Studios umbrella, there is a whole host of other podcasts that you can binge right now, and their content, all of them, fall into the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious category. For example, if you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, you should go check out my other podcast called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear from some other voices within our studio, like Luke LaManna. Luke LaManna is a military veteran. He has a super iconic, really deep radio voice, and he has two shows. One is called Wartime Stories, where he basically looks at strange, dark, and mysterious Wartime Stories, and his other show is called Redacted, where he looks at information that used to be classified and he dives into it with his military expertise and experience, and he basically shows you the lies and secrets and half-truths that the most powerful institutions in the world have been keeping from us. We also have shows that are just plain creepy and unsettling, like Bedtime Stories, hosted by Richard Weil, where he dives into the supernatural and cryptids and mysterious deaths. I mean, basically his whole kind of niche is things that keep you up at night. And then two other shows that fall into that sort of unsettling, creepy vibe are Late Nights with Nexpo, hosted by the famous YouTuber Nexpo, where he dives into true, crazy, scary stories. And then we also have another show called Run Fool, hosted by Rodney Barnes. And Rodney is like an icon in the horror genre at large. And on his show, he just dives into this wild, chilling lore, like horror lore. People love that show. Or if you're a history buff and you really want stories that are really rooted in the fabric of our timeline, I mean, stories that are truly historically accurate, but still strange, dark, and mysterious and crazy, well, check out A Twist of History, hosted by Joel. He's great voice. He's a very thorough host. Those stories all have really cool endings, big plot twists at the end. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, go check out these shows. You can look for them either by name or simply by looking for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform. They are available right now. Enjoy.
In 2010, Jan Maccabee was living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry, and periodically she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend she'd been texting earlier that said, "The woods just went completely silent. Very odd." As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her. And she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone and she raises it up and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess. And so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it. And I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it, and I had a clear shot of this thing. So I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself. The idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops. She just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head. And as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens and that's it. That night when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what happened to her in the tree stand because, again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they clean up, they sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails. And at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears him and says, oh, what are you looking at? And he said, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds, and then at some point the light kind of went back into the forest, and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before, the exact same thing happened, and it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing, and as soon as he finishes, she says, what time did he say that happened? Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him, and so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, it was between 7:50 and 8. Why? At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind, and she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, here, let me take a look at it. As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, well, did your hair get in front of the lens? And she said, no, I was holding it about a foot away from my head and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair. And so he looked at it again and he asked her, well, did you put your finger over the lens maybe? And she said, yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible. And so not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, did you manipulate your resolution settings? And she said, no, I don't even know how to do that. So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story. And so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, how she was positioned in the tree stand and where the sun was and how far away this thing was and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. Somewhere out in the Sierra Nevada mountain range lies a small hunting camp that's been there since the 1950s. Despite its fame, only a handful of people know exactly where this camp is. But even if you were given explicit directions on how to get there, you might just walk past it because it's tucked away in the middle of the woods up on this mountain. It's just a small fire pit, a couple of logs around it, another log set up for cutting wood, and there's some paths that have been beaten down over the years from its occupants, but it's pretty much unremarkable. According to camp members, the fastest way to get to the site is by horseback, and it's approximately 8 miles, and it's through very rugged terrain on this mountain, and it includes a 4,000-foot elevation gain. However, this 8-mile trail is not marked, and every year it changes slightly because trees will fall along the way, changing the topography. Ron Moorhead, who's one of the 4 original camp members, laments the fact that anybody knows anything about this campsite. He wishes they could have kept it a secret, but he knew that wasn't an option after what they discovered there in late 1971. In early 1971, Ron was a young man, and he was invited out for the first time to the Sierra camp by the 3 founding members. When Ron got there, he fell in love. It was this beautiful, natural, pristine wilderness that overlooked this amazing valley, and they're surrounded by these huge white fir trees. There's a freshwater stream that trickled by, and in terms of hunting, the deer were plentiful. Ron said this campsite was the closest to heaven he thinks he'll ever get. The only real drawback of the site was the large bear population, but they always had guns on them, and they built this shelter out of heavy fallen timbers that they could go inside, shut the door, and they'd be protected from the bears until they left. When there wasn't a bear threat, they slept on the ground in tents. In late 1971, Ron came back to the camp with the other 3 founding members. They'd had a great day of hunting, and they were standing around the campfire just chatting with each other when they started hearing a grunting sound not far away from them in the forest. Now, typically, whenever a bear came to their campsite, it was usually at night, and they would hear it grunting somewhere off in the forest, and as soon as they heard it, they would stop and they would listen to kind of confirm it was a bear, and if it was, they would go inside of their shelter and they would wait for it to leave. But this time, when they stopped to listen to confirm it was a bear, the sound they heard next was something they had never heard before, and it was so frightening they almost fell over each other running to get inside of the shelter. It was like a whooping sound you would expect from an ape, except instead of a series of whoops like you would expect from an ape, it was one loud whoop, and then silence, and then another creature somewhere else made a responding whoop that sounded different than the first. There was at least 2 creatures that were basically speaking to each other out in the forest out of view. Ron would say, as these creatures were howling and whooping at each other out in the forest, the men were huddled around inside of the shelter looking at each other like, what is that? Has anybody heard that sound before? And nobody knew what it was. And after a little while, they heard these creatures running towards the camp. They were pretty well off, but they heard these heavy footsteps approaching. And so Ron and the others, they put themselves up against these slats inside of the shelter where they could look out in the direction where these creatures were, and they're staring out just past the light of their campfire into the dark forest, and they hear these things running, and they stop. They don't come into the clearing. It's like they're just outside of where they could see. And then their tone completely changes. These creatures, which are now one on one side of the camp and one on the other, begin speaking to each other in a language that almost sounds human, but it was nonsensical. It sounded like an imitation of a human language, but not human. And so Ron and the others are terrified, and they're just staring through the slats, waiting to see this creature that's going to emerge at some point, but it never does. Instead, the creatures continue to stay outside of the light, and they move around behind their shelter out of view. And so Ron and the others move to the very middle of their shelter to get as far away from the walls as they can, because there are breaks in the walls, and they're worried one of these things is going to reach through and grab them. But finally, after hours of these creatures running around the perimeter of their camp, communicating in this totally otherworldly language, they started whooping again and ran off. And for the rest of the night, Ron and the other 3 stayed right in that shelter. The next day, when the sun came up, the men were out of that camp as fast as they could. These are hard, rugged men, and they were very shaken up by this experience. And they tried to talk about it, but there was just no way to describe what they were hearing and experiencing. And so they just decided they just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, and they'll deal with this later. But as soon as they got out of the woods and back to their homes, they didn't talk about it anymore, except Ron became obsessed with whatever it was that was making that sound. He so desperately wanted to find out what it was. And so he convinced the other 3 members to come with him and go back to the campsite, except this time Ron was going to bring an audio recorder, and he was going to try to capture some audio of these creatures. And so the 4 men went back to the campsite. They didn't even hunt that day. They stayed right near the campsite. They made this big fire, and they're all just kind of nervously sitting there waiting, kind of hoping it happens and also hoping it doesn't happen. And at some point in the evening, Ron said he heard heard footsteps way out in the middle of the forest, and they sounded like they were running towards the camp. The four men sprint inside the shelter, lock it behind them, and Ron turns on the audio recorder. Now, before you listen to this famous recording, here are its bona fides. After being recorded, Ron sent it to Dr. R. Lynn Curlin, who is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Wyoming, and he and his team analyzed it, and they concluded that 1, it was unaltered, so it's not been edited, it's not been doctored in any way, it's an authentic audio recording. And 2, whatever was making the sounds could not have been a man, because their vocal range was dramatically higher and lower than that of a human's. The doctor said, based on average pitch and tract length, the creature that was making the sound most likely was between 7'3" and 8 feet tall. In addition to the Dr. Curlin examination, a cryptolinguist expert named Scott Nelson also pointed out that it would have been nearly impossible in 1971 for Ron or any of the other hunters to dub the sound of their voices, which are on the recording, over the sounds that these creatures were making, because a couple times in the recording you hear both sets of voices happening at once. That's something you couldn't have done in 1971. Despite numerous attempts to debunk this recording, it still stands as a legitimate, unedited recording, although what they were recording is still a mystery. Have a listen.
There's 2 of them across the creek at the big rocks. It's a hard act to follow.
It sounds like he talks to others and they talk to each other.
Yeah. Right there, I just seen movement right through there.
Shortly after this recording was made, Ron stopped hunting at this camp. However, over the years, he has gone back several times because he's obsessed with trying to find out what's out in the forest, but he says to this day, he still has no idea. In 2005, Eric Martin was working in a paper mill in Maine, and he had been working at this paper mill for 20 years, and he was reaching up to get something on a shelf when he threw his back out. And in fact, he had slipped a number of discs, and it ultimately meant he was not able to work anymore. He was going to be disabled. And so he's suddenly out of work. His wife, Shelly Martin, was not working at the time, but when he couldn't work, she needed to get a job. And so Shelly, who had not worked in a long time, was able, through some connections, to land a job in her hometown in Maine called Palmyra. Palmyra was a very small rural community. I mean, we're talking maybe 1,200 people that lived there. They also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea who was not eager to go, but it was the only place they could afford, and so they had to go. Luckily, because Palmyra was such a cheap place to live relative to where they had been living, that for less money, they actually ended up getting a bigger piece of property than they had lived in before. It's this beautiful farmhouse that sat on a whole bunch of acreage, but it was incredibly isolated. You had to go down this bumpy access road to get to their long driveway, and then once you were on the property, you'd look out and it was just a full 360 degrees of very dense forest that virtually no one was in. There was no nature trails. It was just dark, dense forest everywhere you looked. So even though no one's that happy about it, they end up moving into this farmhouse, and as they're unpacking their truck, Eric picks up one of his many rifles that he owned. Eric came from a long line of hunters. He loved to hunt. It was his favorite thing to do, and he had a whole bunch of guns that he kept. And as he's carrying the rifle into the house, Shelly says, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house. You have a barn, you're gonna put your guns in there." This had always been a point of contention for them in their marriage. Shelly just didn't feel safe having guns in the house, especially having kids in there. And so ultimately Eric agrees, okay, fine, I won't put my guns in the house, I'll put them in the barn. And so he went in the barn, and he and his son, Sean, who he had come out to help him, they built this gun case for all of his rifles. It was very heavy duty. They put it in the barn, and then they locked that and then locked the barn itself. So they were totally secure in the barn, but definitely not readily accessible. Over that first year, Shelley and Eric developed this ritual where at the end of the day, they would go out on the front porch of their farmhouse and look out onto the front yard, and they would drink coffee. It was something they both looked forward to, and virtually every night they did this. And so almost exactly a year after moving in, it was in early 2006, Shelley and Eric are sitting on their front porch, enjoying their coffee, they're chatting, and Shelley thinks she sees something in the woods. Now, you have to understand the layout and how far away they are from the woods to get a sense of what they were seeing. Right in front of their porch was a gravel road where they parked their cars. About 20 meters away from their house to the left is their barn, and beyond the barn, basically straight out from the porch, is this huge open field where there's no trees or anything. It was like open grazing area. And then way beyond the field was the beginning of this tree line, of this really dense forest. So we're talking at least a couple hundred meters away where she sees these lights. And she described it as like a pulsating light. It did not look like a car or some sort of vehicle, not to mention there was no road out straight ahead from their porch. It was just a dense forest where there was absolutely no one that should have been in there. Eric immediately, when he sees the lights, he thinks there's a poacher on his property, someone illegally hunting on his property. And so he gets Sean, his son, who did not live with them but was staying the night that night, he gets him to come outside and say, hey, do you think that's a poacher down there at the edge of our tree line? And Sean's like, I don't know, maybe. Eric decides that he wants to go tell this person to leave his property. And so he asks Sean to come with him. They figured they would just get to the edge of the property and yell out, hey, this is private property, you need to leave. As they're walking across the field and they're getting closer to the tree line, the lights, those pulsating lights, begin to fade and disappear back into the woods. And they get all the way up to the tree line and they can't see any lights at all. Even though at this point, standing on the edge of the forest, Eric and Sean are fairly confident that this poacher has left, they decide, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods. Even though it's totally dark, we're not going to get lost. We'll walk a little ways into the woods and just continue to yell, this is private property, so they really do leave. And so they begin walking, and it's a very dense forest, lots of low-hanging limbs. It's not somewhere that's easy to walk. There's no walking trails or anything like that. And they walk, 10, 15 meters into the woods, and then they hear what sounds like someone walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away from them on their left. And they both stop and they look. They didn't want to take any chance that they were being stalked by a predator. And so they thought, you know what? The lights are gone. I don't know what animal this is. Let's just get out of here. About a month goes by, and Nathan, who is Chelsea's boyfriend, was staying with the family at the farm. And it was the first nice spring day. I mean, it was a very dark and dreary winter. Maine winters tend to be that way. And so that weekend, Nathan and Chelsea decide, let's go walk around the woods. So they take the two family dogs and they start walking across that big field in front of the house into the forest, the same area where Sean and Eric have been looking for those lights and then heard what sounded like an animal that was near them. And so at first, Chelsea has the dogs on leashes, but they get to the forest and she lets them off their leash to let them go run around and go crazy because they've been cooped up because of the wintertime as well. The two dogs instantly take off running for about 100 meters, and then they come to a dead stop right outside this big mound. It looks like a dirt mound, but they get up close to it and they can tell that it's actually more like a den. There are these huge pieces of wood that have been leaned into like a lean-to type structure with moss and dirt and grass put all over the outside. I mean, it looks like a very intentionally made mound, and there's a circular hole that's been created right on the front of it. And the dogs have stopped right outside and they're poking their heads in and smelling into this hole. And Nathan and Chelsea are looking at this thinking, who did this? Is this like a hunter's thing? Is this something a hunter might make? Would an animal make this? This seems really big for some animal to make this, but it definitely was made on purpose, whatever it is. And so Nathan, he just kind of looks down into this den, but it's totally dark, and he thinks he hears growling coming from inside of the den. And so without any hesitation, he goes, we gotta go. I don't know what's living in there, but we gotta go. And so they take the dogs, they put them back on leashes, and the two of them get out of the forest as quickly as they can. When Nathan and Chelsea came back to the house, they told Eric and Shelley, and actually Sean was there too, and they said, hey, we found this den of some kind out in the middle of the woods, basically straight out from your front porch. And that's when Eric and Sean said, well, about a month ago, we were out in that same area, and we could have sworn we heard some animal stalking us. A couple of months go by, and Eric and Shelley are sitting on their front porch having their coffee ritual, and there was just this low mist that kind of hung over the entire field. And as they're sitting there, they're commenting on how creepy it was. And what started as just kind of a friendly discussion about the general creepiness took a turn when they realized that they couldn't hear any wildlife. No crickets, no animals, no anything. And normally at night, because they were out here all the time, it was humming with life. And so Shelly had this high-powered flashlight that she always had out with her, and she starts scanning the property, not knowing what she's looking for, but it just seemed really odd that they couldn't hear any wildlife. But after she scans across the whole field, she doesn't see anything, and so she puts her flashlight down and just starts talking to Eric about whatever they normally talked about over coffee at night. Eric would say in numerous interviews that for whatever reason, when she put that flashlight down, he suddenly felt like they were in danger. He's looking out, he doesn't see anything, and then all of a sudden he says, you know what? We gotta go inside. I don't know what it is, but we gotta go inside. And Shelly's like, come on, I wanna stay out here for a little bit longer. We'll go in a few minutes. And Eric stands up and he's like, no, go inside. And he tries to grab her to kind of push her into the house. And she's kind of fighting against him. And then all of a sudden, Shelly stops. And she goes, did you hear that? And Eric immediately knew that whatever it was, it's the reason he had that sudden feeling of being in danger. Eric turns around and he can't see anything because it's too dark. Shelly grabs her flashlight and she begins scanning the tree line. And she gets to the field and gets about halfway across the field right in front of them, and she stops. Because right in the middle of the field are 3 creatures that look like wolves. These huge creatures that are looking right at them. 2 others join them. So there's 5 wolf-like creatures that are staring at them right from the middle of their field. She says to Eric, what are those? And Eric, who's an experienced hunter, he has no idea. He goes, I think they're bears. They could be wolves. We gotta go inside. And so Shelly's just holding the light and they start charging directly at her so fast that she wasn't able to keep the light on them. They were already halfway across the field. They go inside, they shut the door and they lock it. And without saying a word, the 2 of them make their rounds across the entire bottom floor, lock every window, close every blind, make sure everything is shut. There was something different about these 5 creatures. The way they started running towards them, it just felt like they were targeting Eric and Shelly. And so even after the house had been secured, they didn't feel safe. And so they're standing in the middle of their cabin and Eric's saying, my guns are in the barn. We have no protection. And Shelly is like, whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what these are. It could be a bear, it could be a wolf, we don't know. Don't go out there. Shelly goes upstairs, she shuts off all the lights, she makes sure all the windows are shut. And then she goes to Chelsea's room, her daughter, and she wakes her up and she says, hey, come here, you gotta look at this. And they go to the window and they kind of like poke their head into the window because they don't want to like totally open it up and stare out because they don't want the creatures to see them. But they're kind of poking their head out the window and she's like, look. And standing on the gravel are these 5 creatures that are just standing in a row looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting for them to come out the front door. They were just patiently standing there looking at the house. It did not look like normal animal behavior at all. And as she's looking, one of the animals looks up at Shelly in the window and the creature stands on its 2 legs. It gets on its hind legs and looks at her. And Shelly gasps and falls over because the creature's like 8 feet tall. And so Shelly's on the ground looking at Chelsea and she can't believe what she just saw. It's like her brain can't process that this creature, one, had even seen her. They barely had their head up in the window. But that it stood on its hind legs, that it was so big. What are they doing? Sitting in a row right on the outside of the house waiting for us? What's going on here? And so Shelly tells Chelsea, get in your bed, don't go to your windows, don't leave this room. And that's when Shelly also remembers that she hasn't heard her 2 dogs. And she's worried they might be outside. And so she starts quietly walking all along the top floor looking for her dogs. She's calling to her 2 dogs and they don't come out. Goes into the master bedroom and finds her 2 dogs hiding in the corner of the room next to each other. Like they're startled by whatever it is outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs thinking he needed to go to the barn and he needed to get his guns to protect the family. But he knew that between his own disability, he can barely walk very fast and he'd have to unlock the barn and then he'd have to pull down the gun case, unlock that. All the while he's exposed to these animals that are out there. And so the next best thing in his mind is maybe he could run outside, get in his truck and back the truck up to the front door. And then he could get his wife and his daughter to come out, jump in the car and they could drive away. So he just goes to the window and he pulls the blinds aside to look outside and those 5 creatures are now gone. They're not sitting on the gravel path right in front of the house. He doesn't know where they are, but they're not in front of the house. And so he closes the blinds and he's like, well, I don't know where they are. It's too dangerous to go out there. He starts pacing some more and he goes back to look and he sees them back in the field where they first saw them, all 5. You can see all 5, they're facing the house still. but he can see them because the moon has now popped through and he's got illumination on the field and he can see all 5. And he's like, okay, maybe if I just keep my eye on them, I can open the door, run out, get the car, back it up without them seeing me. And so without telling Shelly, he opens the door and he goes onto the front porch and he sees them out in the field. He's got a good line of sight on them. Quiet as he can, he walks down the steps and he makes his way over to his truck, which is about 10 meters away. And as he's getting closer and closer to his truck, he's got his eye on the creatures that are in the field. They haven't moved. They apparently haven't seen him. He gets to the driver's side of his truck and he's got his keys out and he's kind of fumbling to hit the unlock button, and then his motion sensor light kicks on. And he's so on edge being out there, when the light kicks on, he drops his keys because he's so startled. And the first thing he does is he looks towards the field and he sees that one of the 5 creatures is now standing on its hind legs looking at him directly. Before he even bends down to get his keys, he sees them all running towards him. He reaches down, he grabs his keys, he runs back to the house as fast as he can, and he gets inside and slams it right as he can hear them crossing the gravel right in front of the house. And he hears them bound onto the porch and start running around the wraparound porch. He's too scared to even look in the window, so he ducks down to get out of view. Shelly, who was upstairs, can hear everything going on and she yells, "Eric, what's going on?" And he goes, "Stay up there, stay up there." Shelly, Eric, Chelsea, everyone's just frozen waiting, knowing that these creatures are right on the other side, walking along his wraparound porch. And after a while, he hears the footsteps of these creatures leave the porch and go back onto the gravel area. And at some point, he pokes his head up and he looks, and all 5 are sitting there just facing the house, waiting for them to come out of the house. And so he scurries up the stairs to where Shelly and Chelsea are, and they just are so scared. So they decide they gotta call the police. If nothing else, the police will drive up and their vehicle might scare away these creatures. But on the phone, Shelly lets on that what they're really scared about is something on their property. In fact, it's 5 creatures, things running around outside their property. And immediately the police officer who's responding to this, he's like, all right, well, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear? And finally she's like, no, can you please just come over here? And he's like, listen, ma'am, just keep your door shut, keep your windows shut, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And ultimately that's how the call ends. They're on their own. The family felt helpless, and Eric especially felt really frustrated because he can't protect his family. He doesn't have a weapon, he can't get to his vehicle, they're just trapped. And so they decide the only thing we can do is barricade ourselves inside of the house. And so for the next 30 minutes, they put heavy furniture in front of all the doors and the windows. They blocked everything as best as they could. They got kitchen knives and they got an axe that they had inside to chop some wood. And so they go upstairs, they lock themselves in the master bedroom with their weapons and their dogs, and they get on the bed and they just decide all we can do is wait until the sun comes up. During the time they were barricading their house, they would look out from time to time and they would see the 5 creatures just sitting on that gravel area right in front of their house, just waiting for them. When they finally went upstairs and barricaded themselves in that room, they immediately heard the creatures move off of the gravel, and they heard a couple of them at least walk onto the porch and start pacing around the porch. And it's totally silent besides the sounds of these creatures. And they were clearly communicating with each other. They were bumping into walls and then they were howling at each other. There was clear communication happening where they were trying to coordinate some sort of attack on the family. Now, the way the house was set up is there was a 2nd floor roof, and then the 1st floor was a little bit wider than the 2nd floor and had its own kind of separate roof. And after a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They left the porch and it's just silence. And then they would hear them jump onto that 1st roof. The scary thing about this is that if you walked around the roof, you could actually look into the 2nd floor windows. And so they're laying there and periodically they'd be looking out their window. There was windows on either side of the room they were in, but there was a thin curtain between them and the window. And so from time to time, these creatures would walk past their windows and they would stop, they'd put their paws up onto the window and they would look inside. But there was a very thin sheet between them and the glass, so they couldn't see the creature and the creature couldn't see them. All night, they're listening to these creatures running around. And sometimes they'd hear really loud scratching, like they had figured something out and they were trying to burrow their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke the glass. They never got inside the house. As the sun started to come up in the morning, the creatures jumped off the roof and they could hear them running away. And for about an hour, they didn't hear anything outside. The sun's come up and they felt safe again. And so they left their room, they go downstairs, and they finally open it up, and all over their property are signs of huge creatures that had been on their property. Massive footprints with huge claws at the end. They found tufts of hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier is they found all these points on the house in particular on the second floor when they were walking on that roof, where there was clear markings that they had tried to burrow into the house. There were these deep-seated scratch marks into the side of the house. The front door had been scratched apart. I mean, it was very clear that whatever these creatures were, they were trying to get into the house, but they had just been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the family that they sold the house and they moved very quickly after that, and they have not experienced anything like that since they left. In 2004, wildland firefighters were called into a forest in central Idaho to combat an emerging fire. By the time the crew arrived at this forest, it was clear this fire was spreading a lot faster than they anticipated. As a result, Mike, who was the assistant superintendent, basically the second in command of this particular crew, he said he was going to hop on the ATV and drive off way ahead of them to see if they needed to spread out farther to stop this fire. So Mike hops on an ATV and he takes off down this ancient looking logging road that probably hasn't seen a vehicle or a person in decades. Mike had made it about a half mile down this trail when he noticed out of the corner of his eye a bobcat was running perpendicular to him straight out of the forest as if it was going to cross the road about 100 feet in front of him. Mike comes to a stop and thinks, this bobcat doesn't know I'm here. It probably is not used to seeing people. It's going to come out into this trail, see me, get spooked and run away. But instead, this bobcat runs directly into the middle of the road, turns and faces Mike in a very aggressive posture. Mike is shocked at what he's seeing because he knows bobcats are notoriously elusive and they're nocturnal. So for this thing to be out in the daytime and to be intentionally blocking his path and standing there aggressively like it's going to attack him was so out of the ordinary. So the two of them are just looking at each other, not moving for about 10 seconds until this bobcat opens its mouth and then begins screaming like a person. It did not seem like the right sound for what he was looking at. He said more than scary, it was just intensely weird. And just as quickly as this bobcat has arrived, it stops screaming, turns and runs to a tree, sprints up the tree and climbs onto this branch that happens to be perched right over the trail he's on. And Mike's looking up at this bobcat that's right over this trail, and he knows if I'm going to continue going down this trail, I have to go under this screaming bobcat. Although totally freaked out, he knew he needed to keep going down this trail, and he's thinking to himself, you know what, this bobcat is probably just scared of me, and that was its reaction, as bizarre as it was. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts slowly moving down the trail, the whole time keeping his eye on the bobcat, making sure it doesn't show any sign like it's going to leap off onto him. And as he got closer and closer, he just gunned it and sped underneath the branch, and luckily it didn't jump down on him. And as he got a little bit farther away, he turned up to look, and the bobcat had turned around and was still watching him very intently sitting on this branch. Mike makes it about another half mile down the road before he sees something else that's very strange. He sees a cabin. It's this little tiny cabin that's tucked away in the woods, and he's thinking to himself, I'm on federal land. There aren't supposed to be any private structures here. And he figures, even if this is illegal, I do need to stop and make sure no one's in there because there's this huge fire coming this way. And so he parks his ATV and he starts walking off the trail towards this cabin. And as he gets closer, he can tell it's not only a very old cabin, but it's almost certainly abandoned because he can see all these slats that have been put over all of the windows, like it's been boarded up. But when he got up close, he noticed something strange. The door itself into this cabin was not boarded up, and the doorknob was missing, and in its place was this shiny silver chain link that was thread through the opening where there should have been a doorknob around a wooden post that was right outside the door. Basically a makeshift lock because there was no doorknob to it. And he's thinking how weird it is that in the middle of this forest, on an old ancient logging road that clearly no one goes down, where bobcats are running around freely, that there would be this new chain here, which indicates someone must have been here recently. And so he bends down to look through the space that was still there from where the doorknob should have been, and he looks inside and he can't really see anything. And so he takes his flashlight and he shines it in, and he can't believe what he's looking at. There's all this furniture inside this tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it's all upside down. And he's just totally creeped out. So he puts his flashlight away and kind of backs up, and he starts walking back towards the road, and he can't help it, but the whole time he's looking over his shoulder back at the cabin, like someone's gonna emerge from outside of this cabin. He gets to the road, and by the time he's there, he's running. He jumps on his ATV, he whips it around, and he starts blazing back up the logging road back towards his crew. And when he turns the corner to where that bobcat was, he sees there is now a Native American woman standing in the middle of the path. She's wearing this tattered white nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's standing in the same spot he saw that bobcat. And she's looking at him as if she's expecting him, like she's been tipped off that he's gonna be here. And he stops about 100 feet away from her, and now he's officially freaked out. He's still looking over his shoulder towards that cabin, because now everything is just totally weird to him. And before he has a chance to do anything, this woman lets out a scream, a blood-curdling scream that is identical to the bobcat's scream. And so Mike is totally unnerved by this. Everything about this day has really gone sideways as this woman is screaming at the top of her lungs, and then suddenly she stops. Mike's still just standing there like, what's going on? And she runs to the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier, and she climbs up this tree and gets onto the branch where the bobcat was and perches like an animal on the branch looking at Mike. And now, just like the bobcat, Mike is gonna have to drive right underneath this woman who is perched over the trail. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts driving, and he's staring at this woman, and now her mouth is just open like she's about to scream again. And as soon as he got close, he gunned it and went right underneath her. And he turned around after he got some distance away from her, and she's still on the branch, now turned around facing him as he drives away. He goes back, he tells the crew what he saw, and as much as they all want to go back and see this woman and see this cabin, they know they can't. They got to fight this fire. And so ultimately they do that, and then they leave. A couple of days later, Mike was in a bar in the town right near the forest they had just been in fighting that fire, and Mike had seen the woman in the cabin, and he struck up a conversation with a local. And he said, hey, do you know of any buildings that are in that section of the forest? And the guy kind of laughed, and he was like, you know, the only building I ever heard of out there was apparently some cabin where some crazy lady thought of herself as a witch, and she apparently had a bobcat for a pet. And so we as kids were just told to stay away from there. So besides that, I don't know. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One morning in 1995, two campers were inside of their little nylon tent inside of this huge forest in Arizona when they started to hear this loud rumbling sound. And so, curious, they unzipped their tent and they looked in the direction the sound was coming from, and it was coming from this dirt road, kind of straight up ahead of them. And at first, all they could see was this huge dirt and dust cloud kind of barreling towards them. And then in the middle of this cloud, suddenly something appeared that both of these campers knew should not have been in this forest. And so seconds later, this thing blew past them and disappeared into the trees in the other direction. And for a moment, the two campers had no idea what to do. They began to kind of rationalize why this thing was here, but before they got very deep into that conversation, they began hearing the rumbling sound again, and they looked, and sure enough, the big thing was coming back. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's maple syrup with brake fluid. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late on the night of May 27th, 1995, a long-haul truck driver named Devin Williams pulled his gigantic refrigerated semi-truck into a truck stop in a city called Kingman, Arizona. After putting his truck in park, Devin reached over and grabbed his sleeping bag off the passenger seat and began to unroll it. Devin would normally get out and use the bathroom and brush his teeth before going to sleep for the night. But this night, Devin was so exhausted that instead of going in, he just unfurled that sleeping bag and then climbed behind the front two seats of his truck and got into what's called the sleeper cab, which is an area behind the front two seats in the cab where drivers can lay down and rest. Devin had been on the road for the last 4 days, basically non-stop, and all he wanted to do was just finish the stupid route and get back home to his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in the tiny town of Americus in Kansas. Devin hated being away from his family for long periods of time, which unfortunately was part of his job, being a long-haul truck driver. But they needed the money because he and his wife had just bought a new house and it was a total fixer-upper, and so they needed to do a whole bunch of repairs to turn that house into a home. And so, missing his family and just wishing he was done with this route, Devin laid in his sleeping bag in the sleeper cab trying to fall asleep, but he just couldn't. And unfortunately, as Devin knew, if he didn't sleep this night, then he would have to take another break later on this route to rest, because he couldn't just continue to drive with absolutely no sleep. And so taking an additional break that he was not prepping for could affect his ability to get home on time. It was Saturday night, and the strawberries and lettuce that Devin was hauling inside of his truck were due in Kansas City, Missouri, 1,300 miles away, on Monday morning. And so Devin began doing the math in his head. If he stopped a little while later to take another sleep break, would he still be able to cover those 1,300 miles by Monday? And he just wasn't sure. Everybody at the trucking company where Devin worked knew the 29-year-old as being very easygoing and good-natured. Trucking was very hard. People drove insanely long hours on very little sleep, and some people even took drugs to stay awake even longer to make sure they hit their deadlines. And so truckers have kind of earned the reputation of being very rough and tough people. And Devin certainly looked rough and tough. He was this big guy who wore cowboy hats, he had a big Fu Manchu mustache, he had tattoos. But in reality, despite how he looked, he was actually like a gentle giant. And really all he talked about were his kids, who he was totally devoted to. The only time anyone at this company saw Devin get mad was when his work interfered with his ability to see his family. And now, as Devin tossed and turned inside of his sleeper cab, he was getting mad because he was thinking this stupid route and his inability to sleep during this particular break was very likely going to interfere with seeing his family. And after an hour of Devin getting angrier and so not sleeping at all, he finally just gave up on sleep. He chucked his sleeping bag, he climbed out of the cab, and he headed into the truck stop, where he went to the bathroom, he got a bite to eat, and then he called his boss, and he told him that he had just made a stop in order to sleep, but he couldn't, and so he was just going to hit the road again. But don't worry, even though I need another break in order to sleep, I will be in Kansas City on Monday morning with this delivery on time. After speaking to his boss, Devin left the truck stop, climbed back into his truck, he fired it up, and then before long, he was back on the highway driving east. Devin's boss was a guy named Tom Wilson, and he didn't find anything unusual about this phone call he got from Devin. Maybe it was a little unusual that Devin was unable to sleep, and that he called his boss to say he was unable to sleep, but Devin sounded totally normal. And so that night, Tom was not worried at all that Devin would not make it to Kansas City by Monday morning. Devin was like one of his most reliable guys, and so if Devin said he was going to be there on Monday morning, even if he needed extra breaks along the way, then he would be there on Monday morning. But on Monday morning, the distribution center in Kansas City, Missouri, where Devin was supposed to go and drop off the lettuce and strawberries, called Tom Wilson and they said, "Hey, your driver's not here yet. What's going on?" Now, at first, Tom was actually really annoyed with the distribution center because he felt like, okay, the clock has just struck the deadline. Devin will likely arrive in the next few minutes, and they're prematurely calling to complain. And so Tom communicated that to the distribution center, and they said, okay, fine, we'll wait a little bit longer. But when almost an hour passed and still Devin had not shown up, the distribution center called Tom back and said, hey, he's not here. Now, after the second call, Tom totally changed his mindset, and he was actually now worried about Devin. And so he apologized to the distribution center and said he would get in touch with Devin as soon as he could and figure out where their shipment was. But Tom couldn't just call Devin and ask where he was and what was going on, because this was back in 1995. They didn't have cell phones, and so Tom basically just had to wait for Devin, who's out on the road somewhere, to stop somewhere and call Tom to tell Tom what's going on. And so all day Monday, Tom sat at his desk waiting for a call from Devin. And when he didn't get a call from Devin, Tom began calling his other drivers all over the country, asking them if maybe they had had some sort of interaction with Devin and knew where he was and why he had not made it to Kansas City on time. But none of the drivers had any idea what was going on with Devin. No one had spoken to him. Then that evening, Tom got a call, but it was not from Devin. It was from Devin's wife, Mary Lou. And she was calling to say, "Where's Devin? He was supposed to be home by now, and he's not. I haven't heard from him in days. What's going on?" And at this, Tom suddenly thought, okay, we have a real problem here. And so when Tom explained to Mary Lou what was going on with Devin, how he had missed this deadline, Mary Lou panicked and immediately called the police. A little while later, a police officer in Americus, Kansas, arrived at Mary Lou's house to take down the missing person report. And after they did that, the deputy assured Mary Lou that very likely her husband would be found and he would be just fine. And so they explained to Mary Lou that what they would do is put out an alert to all the different police departments that fell kind of roughly along the route that Devin's truck had been on, and see if any of them had had some sort of interaction with Devin. You know, maybe he got into an accident, maybe his truck broke down and he was stranded somewhere, you know, maybe he was hospitalized, who knows? But very likely one of these police departments would know where Devin was. And sure enough, after this alert went out, the officer got a call back very quickly from a sheriff's department in a place called Coconino County, Arizona. Coconino County was located 200 miles to the east of Kingman, Arizona, which was where Devin had been on Saturday night but couldn't sleep, and then called his boss to say he was going to hit the road again. But interestingly, the sheriff's department in Coconino County made it very clear to the police officer in Americus, Kansas, that they had no idea where Devin was, but they definitely knew where his truck was. In fact, basically everybody in Coconino County knew where Devin's truck was. It was all anybody in that county was talking about. Because on Sunday, so the day before Devin was reported missing, somebody driving Devin's truck spent the entire day terrorizing hikers and campers inside of the Tonto National Forest in Coconino County. The Tonto National Forest, which is 600,000 acres of just rugged wilderness preserve, was nowhere near Devin's trucking route. In fact, it wasn't near any trucking route ever. It's like 20 miles off of the highway, and the roads in the forest are barely wide enough to support small cars going through, let alone a 48-foot long, massive 10-ton semi-truck like Devin was driving. But on Sunday morning, so roughly 8 hours after Devin had called his boss Tom, two hikers named Lynn and Jack Yarrington were in their tent inside of Tonto National Forest, just having a nice time. It's peaceful, it's quiet, and they're right near this dirt road that kind of bent around a corner. And suddenly, they began to hear a rumbling sound coming from one end of this road. And so they were in their tent, they unzipped it, they looked out, and at first, all they saw on the road coming in their direction was this huge cloud of dust and smoke. And then through the dust and smoke came Devin's humongous truck blazing down this road at practically full speed. And at first, Jack and Lynn are like, how is this truck even in the forest? How did it get here? How did it actually manage to drive to this point? And after Devin's truck whizzed past them and blazed off in the other direction out of sight, Lynn and Jack weren't scared or worried. They were just totally confused. And so they began speculating, like, well, maybe the driver got lost and they're trying to find a place to turn around or something. And sure enough, a couple of minutes later, they heard a rumbling sound and they saw another cloud of dust, and it was Devin's truck now coming back in the other direction on this same dirt road. And so Jack and Lynn, they kind of backed up behind their tent and they watched as this truck blazed past them again, flying out the other direction. And so in some ways that kind of confirmed to Lynn and Jack that yes, this driver, who's definitely driving recklessly at this point, has likely gotten lost. They've managed to turn around, and now they're heading back out to the highway, and that's all this was. And then all of a sudden, as they're kind of chatting about it and laughing about it, they hear the sound of the truck coming back again. And they look up, and sure enough, there's Devin's truck barreling down the road again. Except this time, Jack and Lynn, they looked where Devin's truck was going, and they saw there was a small sedan coming up the road in the opposite direction. So Devin and the sedan are going to collide, and because this road was actually on a turn, the driver of the sedan couldn't actually see the truck, and the driver of the truck, whether it was Devin or somebody else, couldn't see the sedan. And so both drivers are driving towards each other without realizing it, and so Jack and Lynn, they jump up, they begin screaming and yelling at the driver of the truck to slow down, but the truck didn't slow down. It just continued coming down the road, and the sedan driver, he saw Jack and Lynn flailing their arms and trying to get somebody to stop on the road, and so sensing there was another car, the sedan came to a full stop, and then right in front of them, they saw this truck come barreling around the road, and so the sedan began backing up wildly, trying to get out of the way of this huge truck, and then finally, the driver of the sedan just cut the wheel and peeled off the side of the road into the brush, and right as they did, the truck, which had not slowed down at all, even though the driver could have clearly seen the sedan, just whizzed right past the sedan and would have smashed into it if the sedan had not jumped off the road. The driver of the sedan got out of the car, and when Jack and Lynn ran up to him to make sure he was okay, he would tell them that he got a good look at the driver of the truck as he drove past him, and he told them that the driver was just gripping the wheel, looking totally straight ahead, no expression whatsoever, just barreling past him. It was like he didn't even look at the sedan. He was just going. A little later that day, and not far from where this incident had just happened on this road with Jack and Lynn and the sedan, there was this family that was hiking through Tonto National Forest, and they had arrived at this big, beautiful open field in the middle of the forest, and they planned to have a picnic in this field. But as they came out of the tree line and walked into this beautiful open high grass meadow area, they looked out and they saw, just kind of in the middle of the field, was this huge truck that made no sense. How in the world could this truck have gotten to this meadow? They didn't know. But they clearly saw there's a truck, and the father of the family, he saw there was a man standing next to this truck, just kind of looking away from them off at the mountains in the distance. And so this family kind of assumed that the driver of this truck had somehow gotten into this meadow, and maybe their truck was stuck, and so now they need help. And so the father told his family to stay put for a second, and then he, on his own, walked across the meadow towards this truck. And as the father got closer, he did see that very clearly the truck was stuck in the mud. And so this driver very likely is stranded. And so as he got close enough, the father yelled out to this guy and said, "Hey, do you need some help? We can go back and call someone. What can we do for you?" But the man who was standing outside of the truck didn't even turn around to talk to this father. He just kept standing there motionless, looking off into the distance. And so the father made it about 5 or 6 feet away from this guy, and the father just stopped and very clearly said, "Hey, I'm talking to you. Do you need help?" And at this point, the man who was standing next to the truck, he turned around and he looked at the father. And immediately the father kind of backed up for a second because there was something off about this guy. The guy was just kind of standing there and he was staring at the father, and he opened his mouth like he was about to speak. But instead of speaking, he just kept opening his mouth wider and wider until it was as wide as he could get it. And then he began wiggling his lower jaw back and forth as fast as he could, and then clicking his teeth simultaneously. And so the father just began backing up like there was something wrong with this guy. And right as the father was about to just turn around and leave and go protect his family from this guy, the guy stopped with his mouth, and then he just stared directly at the father and said very calmly, "I didn't do it. They did it." Now, when the father heard this, he was already so weirded out by this guy that he didn't even have any questions to follow up with. Instead, he just turned and began running back towards his family. And so, feeling very unsettled, the family, they ran back to their car, they drove back home, and they called the police about this guy and his truck. It would take a deputy from the Coconino County Sheriff's Department a little while to finally navigate their way all the way out to this meadow where this truck and this guy apparently were. And when the deputy got there, they walked out into this meadow, and sure enough, just like the father had said, there was the truck stuck in the mud. And so the deputy began walking out to the truck, expecting to see the driver, this guy who the father had said was acting totally weird. But when the deputy got up there, he found the truck was totally abandoned. There was nobody in the cab, there was nobody nearby. It was just sitting here, but it was still running. And so the deputy tried to open up the cab, but it was locked. He did look inside, and everything looked very neat and orderly. And then he went around to the back of the truck, and he opened up the back doors, and he found the refrigeration unit was still on, and inside of this truck was lots and lots of strawberries and lettuce. So the deputy really didn't know what to make of this truck in the middle of the field, combined with this report that the father gave about this guy who was standing near it, acting totally weird. And so he just checked the license plate of the truck and he ran it against his database to see if there were any matching reports of missing trucks or missing truck drivers, but there weren't any. Because remember, this is on Sunday this is happening, and it wasn't until the next day, Monday, that Devin was reported missing and his truck was added to a list of missing trucks and missing truck drivers. And so the Coconino County deputy just called a towing company who came out and hauled Devin's truck out of the forest. And then 24 hours later, when Devin was reported missing, the Coconino County Sheriff's Department put it all together and contacted the officer in Americus, Kansas to say, okay, we do have Devin's truck, but we don't have any other answers for you. The behavior of the man who was driving Devin's truck through Tonto National Forest was so insanely out of character for someone like Devin that it seemed totally impossible that Devin could have done this. But both Lynn and Jack Yarrington and the other people who saw this truck flying through the forest on that Sunday, they all insisted that the man they saw in the cab driving this truck matched the picture of Devin Williams. But there was absolutely no reason for why Devin would want to go to the Tonto National Forest. And even if he did want to go to this forest for some reason, he should have known that his massive semi-trailer truck was not a good choice to be driving around these narrow dirt roads in the middle of this wilderness preserve. All we know about Devin is that at the time he went missing, all he likely wanted to do was just get home to Americus, Kansas to be with his wife and 3 kids again. That's really all he cared about. The police did consider that, maybe Devin just ran away. But that theory didn't add up. Devin had no criminal record, he had a great relationship with his wife, so there were no issues there, and there were no other kind of outstanding relationship issues with friends or family. And financially, even though it was a little tight, they were doing just fine. They just wanted some extra money to fix up this house and make it really nice. It wasn't like they were struggling to put food on the table. Also, the police considered that, maybe Devin was kidnapped or something. But Devin is like this big, imposing, tattooed cowboy hat, big mustache, tough truck driver. I mean, who's gonna try to kidnap that guy? Devin also had no medical issues, he wasn't struggling with his mental health, he had no neurological abnormalities, he also never used drugs and always passed every single drug test that he got while working for this trucking company. Devin was basically just this totally normal, nice, well-adjusted guy with nothing to run or hide from. And so none of this made any sense. Police mounted a massive search inside of Tonto National Forest, and during the search, the couple, Jack and Lynn Yarrington, who had seen the truck barreling up and down the road and nearly collide with that sedan, they would tell searchers that they actually thought they saw Devin Williams, not in his truck, but out on foot, walking around on Monday morning, so just hours before he would have been reported missing. They said they just saw this guy wandering barefoot down the road as they were driving out of the forest, and they slowed down to ask him if he was okay, and this guy, who looked exactly like Devin Williams, responded by picking up a rock and throwing it at their car. And so Jack and Lynn just drove past him, not realizing that this was the guy who very likely was driving that truck. Now, the police, when they began this search, were pretty confident they would find Devin, especially after hearing from Jack and Lynn that he was pretty likely on foot and without shoes walking around the forest. It seemed like he could not get very far. But despite this huge search, they could not find Devin. There was absolutely no trace of him. And so, after nearly 3 weeks of searching and not finding Devin, the police called off the search. Then, on May 2nd, 1997, so almost exactly 2 years from when Devin had been reported missing, 2 hikers were walking on this trail in the middle of Tonto National Forest, right in the area where police had extensively searched for Devin 2 years earlier. These 2 hikers, they're walking on this trail, and up ahead they see there's this white thing right in the middle of the trail, just kind of sitting out. Now, this is a well-trafficked trail, and so they're wondering, what is this thing? And so they walk up and they see this white thing is a perfectly intact human skull. There's no skeleton, it's just the skull. And so these hikers, they gasp, they can't believe they're looking at a real human head, and they're thinking, how in the world did it get here? Why hasn't anybody else seen this and taken it? Like, how are we the first ones to see this? And so they would end up calling the police. The police would come out, they'd gather up the skull, it would be sent in for testing, and sure enough, DNA testing would reveal the skull belonged to Devin Williams. No one has ever been able to explain what actually happened to Devin Williams, but the discovery of his skull inside of Tonto National Forest nearly guarantees that the driver of the truck 2 years earlier really was Devin, and the guy standing outside of the truck that was stuck in the mud in the meadow was likely Devin, and the guy throwing rocks at Jack and Lynn's car was Devin. People have put forth a whole host of theories about what happened to Devin, ranging from he had some sort of medical event where he kind of lost his mind and that's what caused all this strange behavior, or maybe Devin was on drugs despite not having any history of drug use. Maybe he took a really strong drug and that's what caused him to do all this. And still others believe that maybe there's a paranormal element to this whole story, that perhaps Devin was contacted by aliens and that's what induced all the bizarre behavior, and then ultimately he was abducted by said aliens, and then somehow his skull wound up back on this trail in the middle of Tonto National Forest. And as crazy as that sounds, still to this day, no one has any idea what happened to him, so that theory is just as good as any other. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like this one available exclusively on Amazon Music. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please send the like button a really nice gift basket for their birthday. But don't tell them you've doused it entirely in anthrax. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of February 20th, 1881, a police officer led a search party through the woods in Hill County, Texas, which at the time was a very rural farming community with lots of dense, undeveloped woodland. The officer and the search party were looking for a father of 7 named George Arnold, who had vanished from his home 2 days earlier. The day that George had gone missing was a Sunday, and he, his wife, and their kids always went to church together on Sundays. But on that morning, George had told his family, for reasons unknown, that he actually wanted to stay home, which was very out of character for him. Nonetheless, his wife and kids had gone to church without him, and then when they had returned, George was gone. Now, there was no sign of a struggle or any issues at the house. The only clue as to where George may have gone was a letter he left behind for his wife. And in this letter, he said he had gone off into the woods and that she should not follow him. And so again, that was 2 days ago. And so now the police officer and the search party were searching the forest near the home where George lived. The lead officer is trudging through the woods. They're way off the beaten path at this point. They eventually came to this pretty decent sized clearing. And in the middle of the clearing is this one huge tree. And at the base of the tree was George. So at this point, you need to understand that there was some nuance to the letter that George left behind for his wife. He didn't just say, "I'm going into the woods, don't follow me." He said, "I have to go into the woods." And the way the letter ended was George saying how much he loved his family and wished he didn't have to do this, but he'd given it some thought and it had to be done. Back in the woods, the Maine police officer and the search party, they see George at the base of this tree and they hustle over to him. But even before they were right on top of him, it was obvious he was dead. However, that wasn't the main sentiment as they're walking over, that, oh my gosh, George is dead. Instead, it was like, what happened here? George was chained by his ankle to the tree he was sitting next to. There was a padlock on the chain. There was no way to get it off. George was also completely naked, but his clothes were sort of tattered up and sitting in a pile right next to him. And George was covered in all these scrapes and cuts, and they looked like teeth marks, but not teeth marks from animals, teeth marks from a human's mouth. And then next to him on the ground, along with his clothes, were all these little, like, white stones. But when the officers walked over and looked more closely, they realized the white stones were actually teeth, George's teeth. And the tree that he was lying up against had all these deep gouges in it that sort of looked like if you took your own teeth and began biting into the wood to the point where you were breaking your teeth off, which is apparently what George was doing. And then also scattered amongst his teeth were many of George's fingernails, because apparently George had also been raking his fingernails against this tree until he tore out his nails. And so the officers and the search party are looking at this thinking, why would he do this? This all basically looks self-inflicted. What's going on? Well, it would turn out, quite recently, something very bad happened to George. He was bit by a dog who was carrying rabies. Now, today, if you're bit by an animal that has rabies, you just get a rabies shot. You're good. It's totally curable. But in 1881, the cure didn't exist. And so if you got rabies, it was a 100% death sentence. And so very likely, shortly after getting bit by this dog, George would have begun to have early symptoms of rabies. He would have begun to feel sick and been very irritable. And also, he would have very likely begun to have some hallucinations. And for George, he apparently understood what this all meant. He had rabies, and he knew what was coming next. And he didn't want to put his family in harm's way. Now, George was a very religious guy, so he didn't believe in the idea of taking your own life. And so instead, what he did is he wrote this letter to his wife that sort of broadly explained that I have to do this and I'm so sorry. And then he went into the woods, chained himself there, and basically allowed himself to die this horrible death, where he must have been in so much agony and pain that he's doing things like biting the tree until his teeth broke off and his nails fell off. His death must have been absolutely wretched and painful, but he did it to protect his family. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. You know that feeling when you know you're about to do something like a bad habit and you just can't stop yourself? You see it happening and you know you're not supposed to, but it's like you can't stop. And eventually, if this continues to happen to you and you don't make a change, you start looking internal and saying, like, what's wrong with me? Even though the reality is there's nothing wrong with you. This is part of being human. When I was in the military, I definitely developed some bad habits. And when I transitioned back to being a civilian in 2017, a lot of those bad habits followed. And I definitely found myself in that cycle of like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I stop? Well, let me just tell you, this cycle, these patterns I'm describing, they're not random. The reason this happens is because you have some sort of unresolved issue or issues, and you really need to talk to somebody about it. This is where BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp makes it really easy to access credentialed therapists. BetterHelp also accepts both HSA and FSA cards, making it even easier to prioritize your mental health. In 2024 alone, over 137,000 people used their HSA or FSA benefits for therapy through BetterHelp. So be sure to use yours before they expire. You've been fighting these patterns alone for long enough. Maybe it's time someone actually helped you understand them. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month. There is one person in history whose name is so tied to horror that in many ways it's become sort of synonymous with evil. This person committed some of the world's worst atrocities. And in fact, they could have committed many more that we don't even know about. And part of the reason we don't know about it is because they got away with it.
And even worse, they never came out and said why they did anything. There's no motive, there's no manifesto, there's virtually no communication with authorities or the public or anything. However, there is one time that this killer, for whatever reason, did reach out and communicate with somebody. And this interaction is simply known as from hell. On the evening of October 12th, 1888, a 49-year-old businessman named George Lusk walked into his upscale home in East London. He grabbed the mail that his housekeeper had set out on the table by the door, and he began sifting through it. And at first, all he saw were a couple letters from friends, and he saw a couple of invitations to upcoming parties. And then he got to the bottom of the mail pile, and he stopped. Because at the bottom of the mail pile, there was a postcard and a letter. Over the past 2 months, 4 people had been killed in George's neighborhood. And in fact, the most recent victim was a middle-aged woman who had been killed about 2 weeks ago, really not far from George's home. And on this mail, on these 2 pieces of mail, the return address was the name of this uncaught serial killer. George was so scared of this killer, as he should be, that he had formed this neighborhood watch group to go out and try to catch this killer. And in fact, just recently, when George was just looking out his front window onto the road, just kind of looking around, not part of his neighborhood watch group, but just kind of scanning the area, he had seen this kind of sketchy looking guy with a big thick beard standing on the other side of the road, and he was kind of in this alleyway. And this guy, it looked like he was staring right at George, very intently so. And George at first returned the stare, but then felt so uncomfortable that he drew the blinds and kind of hid from his window. Because again, he's thinking, there is a killer on the loose, maybe that's him. George actually had been so scared at seeing this guy that he had actually gone to the police and filed a report and said, I don't know, I think that guy could have been the killer. But the police really couldn't do anything because all they had was a sort of generic description of some guy standing on the road not doing anything. So nothing was ever done. And so George, even though he was scared, he opened up these letters, and it was even more alarming than he could have thought. Because whoever wrote this, whether it was the killer or not, they were basically taunting George, saying, yeah, I know you stood up the neighborhood watch group. I don't care. I can do whatever I want. I can kill with impunity. In fact, I'm gonna kill 2 people tomorrow night, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. George just gathered up the letter and the postcard. He left his house right away and literally ran to the police station. And when he got there, he showed them the letters and said, look, this is from the killer. It feels authentic. He's gonna kill 2 people tomorrow night. You gotta do something. And so the police, they took the letters and they read them and they agreed that they did seem, authentic. But at the same time, they're like, there's really no way to tell if these are real. I mean, this could easily be a hoax. And even if this was real, what do we do? Who are the 2 people the killer's gonna go after? How can we possibly protect them? George was told to go home and, just play it safe, stay home, stay inside, and let the police do their job. Over the next couple of days, George was basically sitting on pins and needles waiting to find out that, sure enough, a double homicide was committed somewhere in the neighborhood. But there was no news of any homicides. Things were calm. There was no news of the killer anywhere. And so George told himself that, he was overreacting. Clearly those letters he got must have been hoaxes. But then, on October 16th, so 4 days after George received those 2 pieces of mail from the killer, he came home and he went inside and, like normal, his housekeeper had set the mail on the table right inside the house. In addition to all the paper mail, stacked on top of it was this little package, and it was wrapped in brown paper. He picks up the box, and very apprehensively, he begins to unwrap it. And once it opens up, he sees there's a letter sitting on top of this box. And the letter at the top, it says, from hell. That middle-aged woman who had been murdered just a couple of weeks earlier right near George's house, well, when she was found, 1, they identified that she clearly had been killed by the same serial killer that was still uncaught. But 2, she was missing something, her kidney. The package that George received inside of that box itself included half of a kidney. And then the body of the letter explained that this was the other half of that woman's kidney because the killer had eaten the other half. And this half was a gift for George. The letters and the box containing that half of a kidney are considered to be potentially the only authentic communications from Jack the Ripper. Around 7 p.m. on May 21st, 1985, a 17-year-old boy named Jason Finley sat on the edge of his bed in his grandmother's spare bedroom in the suburb of Scotch Plains, New Jersey. He took a deep breath and then grabbed the landline phone next to the bed and then punched in the number of the girl he had been seeing for the past couple of weeks. Jason really liked this girl. Her name was Kathy, and tonight he wanted to finally ask her to officially be his girlfriend. As the phone rang, Jason found himself staring out the window at the raging thunderstorm that was going on outside. In fact, it had been raining so hard that day that Jason and his twin cousins and his grandmother had all basically had to stay inside the whole day. Jason had actually admitted to them earlier in the week that he really wanted to call this girl, Kathy, and ask her to be his girlfriend, but he didn't have the nerve to do it. And they had immediately begun ridiculing him, so now stepping away to make this phone call was kind of like the first moment of peace for Jason. Jason heard Kathy pick up the phone. And when he heard her sweet voice, it was like all his thoughts of his annoying cousins disappeared from his mind, and suddenly Jason was overwhelmed with this urge to just blurt out, "Will you be my girlfriend?" He took a breath like he was about to tell her, about to finally ask her this question. But right before the words escaped his mouth, he felt this unbelievably shooting pain in the back of his head, and then everything went black. At the same time this was happening, down the hallway in the kitchen, Jason's grandmother had just finished making dinner, and so she called out for Jason and the cousins to come set the table. The twins came into the kitchen, but a few moments went by and Jason hadn't shown up yet. So Jason's grandmother told the twins to, go down there and see what he's doing and get him in here for dinner. They walked down the hall, they went into the room where Jason was, and then a moment later, Jason's grandmother heard screams. She rushed down the hallway, she goes into the bedroom, and she finds the twins standing over Jason, and Jason is slumped over in bed, and the phone receiver is up against his ear, but he's not moving. It sort of looked like he was asleep, but when they would shake him and yell to him, he was totally unresponsive. She picked up the phone and she dialed 911. Not long after, an ambulance arrived at the house and EMTs rushed in. They grabbed Jason, they put him on a stretcher, and they rushed him into the ambulance and back to the hospital. But when they got there, Jason was declared dead. Jason was 17 years old and completely healthy. And doctors, when they received him, they would say that there did not appear to be anything wrong with him. Nothing medically anyways. And so basically, Jason's heartbroken family was told, "We don't know what happened. He just died." But Jason's family could not accept that. The family pushed for a much more thorough forensic investigation into his death. And that's when things got weird. And at first, the autopsy showed basically what the doctors at the hospital first thought, which is there isn't a clear reason for why he died. And although it's very tough to accept that, it is the case that people do sometimes just die, even perfectly healthy people. However, the forensic investigator that was doing this very thorough autopsy did discover one thing that the hospital didn't find. And that was that Jason had a ruptured eardrum. Now, generally speaking, this would not have been a big, wow, we figured it out moment. However, the forensic investigator was trying to come up with all these different theories about what could have killed Jason. And when they found the ruptured eardrum, paired with something else they had sort of zeroed in on, which was the weather at the time of Jason's death, they put those things together and realized they had figured it out. It would turn out, when Jason was on the phone speaking to Kathy, lightning struck the phone line outside. The electricity carried through the line, through the phone, into Jason's head, killed him instantly. As for Kathy, she would later say that she could tell Jason was almost certainly going to ask her to be his girlfriend. And she said, had he asked, she would have said yes. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today I'm going to share 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a bowl of chips and some guacamole, but replace the guacamole with wasabi. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. So full disclosure, this is not my personal story, but in order to do this story justice, it has to be told in the first person. So I am simply an actor. I was once on a US military ship in the wardroom, which is the officer's lounge, when the operations officer came inside. This guy was the definition of not a morning person. He was bleary-eyed, he kind of stumbled in, he was like a zombie holding a bagel. He sits down in front of me, he's barely conscious, and he starts gnawing on his bagel, and I'm sitting with my back to the outboard side of the ship. So that's the outside of the ship behind me, and there's a porthole right next to my head where the sun is coming through, and it's hitting this officer directly on his face. And so the officer's looking up at the sun, he's kind of squinting and blocking the sun from his face, and I'm looking at him expecting him to shift left or right to get out of the path of the sunlight. But instead, this officer slowly reaches for the phone on the wall, he brings it up to his head, and he goes, "Yeah, bridge, yeah, this is ops. I need you to adjust our path. Yeah, 156, yep, that's about right. Okay, all right, bye." After he hangs up with the bridge, I'm watching him and he hasn't moved. He's still just looking at the sunlight blazing in on his face. He's just squinting and looking up at it. And then all of a sudden, this port of sunlight just gradually begins to shift off of him and winds up on the wall right behind him where it stops. By ordering the bridge to change the ship's path just slightly, about 15 degrees, it's enough of a change to reposition the sun from his face. He literally redirected thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of people just because he was too lazy to move left or right. I'm in awe. I can't believe he's just done this, and for a second, I worry that he won't realize how unbelievably brilliant this was. And then as I'm looking at him, in between bites, he just looks up at me and smiles and goes back to eating his bagel. In November of 2006, Nintendo came out with a brand new gaming console called the Wii, and it was hugely popular and sold out almost completely right away. By the following January, it was still not on shelves in most places around the world, and so people were going crazy, spending unbelievable sums of money to try to get their hands on this system. A Sacramento, California radio station called KDND got a hold of one of these coveted systems and decided they would give it away during an on-air contest. The contest was going to be called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. And the premise of this contest was simple. The contestants would be given lots of water, and the person who held it the longest, i.e. they didn't urinate, would win the prize. Leading up to this contest, the radio station began promoting it really aggressively on air, and lots of people called in with concerns saying that drinking too much water can actually be deadly. But the station brushed these concerns off and said they were aware of them, and that all contestants would be signing a waiver, and so ultimately the station was not responsible for what happened to them. On the morning of Friday, January 12th, 18 contestants showed up at the KDND radio station and they signed their waivers, although one of the contestants said the waiver only covered publicity issues, not health and safety concerns. One of the contestants was 28-year-old Jennifer Strange, who was a mother of 3, and she was trying to win this Wii for her kids. She, along with the others, after signing their waiver, were ushered into this room where they were handed 8-ounce water bottles. Every 15 minutes, they would be expected to finish that water bottle and then refill it and do it every 15 minutes. And if at any point they didn't completely finish their water bottle in time, or if they got up to use the bathroom, they would lose the contest. The contest started at 6:45 a.m. and by 8 a.m., after 5 bottles had been drank, a number of the contestants began pulling themselves out to use the bathroom. But the radio staff felt like this contest was going to take a really long time, and so they gave the remaining contestants, that included Jennifer, a larger bottle of water to drink from. Over the next several hours, all of the contestants, except for Jennifer and one other, had dropped out because it was just too painful. They had to go to the bathroom. Jennifer was heard on air saying it hurt so much, and one of the hosts laughed and said, "Well, do you need to lay down?" And then somebody piped up and said, "She can't even walk." And so everybody just kind of laughed and did nothing about it. Around this time, a nurse called into the radio station and very emphatically said what they were doing, this contest, was a really bad idea. You're gonna get someone killed from water intoxication. Water intoxication is also known as water poisoning, and in a nutshell, what happens is when you drink too much water, the water dilutes your bloodstream, it can cause swelling in your brain, and it can lead to coma and/or death. The host, after hearing this concern, turned and yelled to the remaining contestants, "Hey, is anybody dying out there?" And then the host just kind of laughed and hung up on the nurse. A little while later, you can hear one of the hosts on air comment on how Jennifer's belly looked really strange. It had become totally distended and bloated, and they said it looked like she was pregnant. At some point, Jennifer and the other remaining contestant began vomiting, but instead of dropping out, they just continued to drink more water and did not go to the bathroom. But finally, it became too much for Jennifer to bear, and she dropped out of the contest and she relieved herself. For coming in second place, she received tickets to a Justin Timberlake concert. On her drive home, Jennifer began experiencing this horrific headache to the point where she was just sobbing uncontrollably. Through tears, she called one of her coworkers and said she just was not going to be able to come into work that day. Her head hurt too much. And so after she hung up, her coworker she had just spoken to was really concerned about her and called Jennifer's mother to let her know what was going on. And about an hour later, Jennifer's mother headed over to Jennifer's house to check on her, and she found Jennifer dead in her bathroom from water poisoning. The station was ultimately sued by Jennifer's family, and they were ordered to pay over $16 million in damages. In 2005, 57-year-old Stephen Slevin was a physically healthy man, but mentally he was struggling. He was depressed and felt like his life didn't have any purpose anymore, and so in August of that year, he decided to just go on a road trip. He didn't know where he was going. He just felt like if I get out on the road and just go driving somewhere, I will feel better. And on this road trip, he eventually began drinking alcohol, and before long, he was swerving along the New Mexico highway, and a police officer saw his erratic driving and pulled him over. Once Stephen failed his sobriety test, the police officer arrested him. Stephen was brought to a local detention center where during his booking process, it was discovered that he had a history of mental illness. And so the officers, following that county's policy, segregated him from the rest of the general population in an effort to protect Stephen from himself. They moved him into a padded cell on the first floor, they removed all of his clothing, and they put him in what's called a suicide smock, which looks like a big blanket wrapped around your upper body. And what it does is it keeps inmates warm and modest, but it also prevents them from balling up their clothes and creating a noose they could hurt themselves with. After a few days in this padded cell, Stephen was moved to another better cell that had a window, it had a shower, it had a toilet, and he was there for 2 weeks under strict medical observation. But at the end of those 2 weeks, for reasons that are not entirely clear, Stephen, this mentally unstable man, was moved into solitary confinement to await trial for his DWI. Solitary confinement is a type of imprisonment where the inmate is shifted into a single-person cell and they are kept there nearly around the clock without any significant interaction with other people or other inmates. The psychological effects of solitary confinement are well documented and terrifying. Just 15 days into solitary can be enough to cause permanent psychological damage. Stephen's first few weeks in solitary were actually okay. He was allowed to write to his family, he was able to detox and reflect on his life. During those first few weeks, it was noted that Stephen was very polite in his very limited interaction with the officers that were dropping food off through the slot in his door. Also, when Stephen had a few minor medical issues, instead of throwing a fit, he just knocked on the inside of his door and waited patiently for someone to acknowledge him, which took a long time, but he never got frustrated or mad. But by January of 2006, so roughly 3 months into his solitary stint, Stephen had not had any updates on when his case was going to go to trial, and Stephen was starting to lose his grip on reality. He was having these severe panic attacks, and he was suffering from intense hallucinations. He desperately wanted to find out how much longer he was going to be kept in the cell, but nobody would tell him. He tried writing his letters to his family asking for help or asking them to try to get an update on his case, but when he went to literally write the letter, his hand shook so severely from the stress and anxiety that he literally couldn't write these letters. Starting that January, Stephen began spending the bulk of his day in the corner of his cell with his knees tucked up to his chest, rocking back and forth. He was allowed out of his cell a few times a month, but in April of that year, that stopped and he almost never left his cell again. And without leaving his cell, Stephen was unable to bathe, and so his skin began developing fungus and began falling off, and his teeth began to rot. Finally, on May 8th, 2007, so 1 year and 8 months of being in solitary confinement, Stephen was transferred out of his cell to a behavioral institute in Las Vegas, Nevada. After bathing and shaving and cutting his hair and receiving proper medical treatment, he was back to his normal self within a couple of days. And while he was there, he had a chance to speak to a lawyer, and the lawyer would say the entire meeting, Stephen was just saying, "Where have I been?" And the lawyer said, you've been in solitary confinement awaiting trial. You've been there for almost 2 years. And to that, Stephen was shocked and literally didn't believe him. He actually couldn't remember that time in his life. It was like it had driven him crazy and he had completely repressed it from his memory. But when the lawyer told him about it, it began to come back into his mind, and he begged the lawyer to not let them send him back to solitary confinement. And his lawyer said, unfortunately, if that's where they're going to keep you, that's where they're going to keep you until you have your trial for this DWI. And unfortunately, we have no idea when that trial is going to be. But stay strong, because it's bound to be soon if they've already transferred you to this institute. Stephen stayed at this institute for 2 weeks, and during that time, he asked constantly about when his trial was going to happen, but nobody knew. And at the end of those 2 weeks, Stephen was abruptly taken out of his room, put in a van, driven back to New Mexico, and put back into his solitary confinement cell. And immediately, Stephen began to deteriorate. And he begged the guards to not put him in this cell, but nobody was listening, and before long, the door had shut, and he was all alone again. Within a couple of days, Stephen developed an abscess in one of his teeth, and he tried to get medical attention, but he didn't get it, and so he sat in the corner of his cell, and for 8 hours one day, he rocked back and forth and violently twisted and yanked and pulled on that tooth until he was able to rip it out of his head. Almost 2 months later, on June 22nd, 2007, Stephen's case was finally put before a judge, and the judge dismissed all of the charges. It's believed the judge found out about this horrible mistreatment of Stephen and took pity on him, but we'll never know. 3 days later, Stephen was released from jail and reunited with his family. He had been in solitary confinement for 2 years without so much as a hearing to tell him what was going on. He had essentially been forgotten about. He would go on to sue the county and win $15.5 million in damages. However, at the same time he's winning this case, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and given less than a year to live. It's unclear if he is alive today. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button some chips and guacamole, but replace the guacamole with wasabi. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short random videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya.